October 1962, a time when the world held its breath, standing on the precipice of destruction, yet so few truly knew how close we came to annihilation. The streets bustled with the rhythm of daily life. Families dined together, and children played under the soft autumn sky. But high above in the cold, unforgiving skies, an American U-2 spy plane soared, its lens capturing something terrible, something that would shake the very foundations of peace. You see, the Cuban Missile Crisis was more than just a political confrontation. It was a moment when all that we take for granted, the sunrise, the laughter of our children, the simple joy of being alive, could have been wiped away in a flash. I want you to imagine it, feel it as we unravel this story step by step, whisper by whisper, the hidden dangers, the frantic negotiations, the weight of decisions made behind closed doors. October 14th, 1962. The world turns as it always does, indifferent to the secrets kept by governments, to the dark moves of military powers. But that day, high in the sky, an American reconnaissance plane reveals the unimaginable. Soviet missile installations nestled quietly in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. These weren't just missiles, no. They were harbingers of destruction, each carrying the weight of a nuclear apocalypse. In those black and white photos, the seeds of Armageddon were revealed to the world. Now let's take a step back. The Cold War had been building for years, a slow boil of tension between two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both armed to the teeth, both locked in an ideological struggle that stretched across the globe. But this moment in 1962 was something different. It was no longer about abstract politics or the shadowy dealings of diplomats. It had become a deadly game, with each side holding the fate of millions in its hands. And at the center of it all was a young president, John F. Kennedy. Barely 45 years old, Kennedy found himself confronting the greatest existential threat any American leader had ever faced. Can you picture him there, sitting in the Oval Office, shoulders weighed down by the unimaginable burden of responsibility? Just a year before, he had navigated the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, and now Cuba once again threatened to drag the world into chaos. But Kennedy wasn't the only one wrestling with these fears. Across the ocean, deep within the halls of the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev believed he had outplayed his American counterpart. Placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, it was a bold move, a dangerous gamble. Khrushchev wanted leverage. He believed that by positioning his missiles so close to American soil, he could shift the balance of power in his favor, force the West into concessions. But what he didn't anticipate was the ferocity of the American response. You see, history often remembers the battles that were fought, but what about the ones that almost happened, the ones that lingered in the shadows, threatening to unravel the very fabric of civilization? Let me take you back to that critical moment when those U-2 photos landed on Kennedy's desk. Imagine the gravity of the situation, the sheer terror that must have coursed through his veins. The military leaders around him, men with medals on their chests, and a lifetime of warfare behind them, urged immediate action. Strike now, they said, bomb the missile sites before they become operational. Invade Cuba before it's too late. But Kennedy certainly hesitated. He knew the risks. A strike on Cuba might remove the immediate threat, yes, but what would happen next? The Soviet Union would retaliate, perhaps in Europe, perhaps even directly against the United States. Missiles could be launched from Russia, from submarines lurking in the depths of the Atlantic. The fragile balance of the Cold War would shatter, and nuclear war, it would be inevitable. In the following days, the tension grew thick, suffocating. The world watched, unaware of just how close we all stood to the edge. The newspapers buzzed with speculation. The radio waves filled with the nervous chatter of a public sensing danger, but not truly understanding its scale. And in the quiet halls of power, the most critical decisions of the 20th century were being made. So on October 22nd, Kennedy took to the airwaves. His voice, calm but resolute, crackled through television sets across the nation and around the world. "We will not tolerate these weapons," he declared. The United States would impose a naval blockade around Cuba, preventing any further shipments of military equipment from reaching the island. Any missile launched from Cuba, he warned, would be met with full-scale retaliation against the Soviet Union. The words echoed through living rooms, boardrooms, classrooms. It was as if time itself had paused, and yet, even as Kennedy's words hung in the air, Soviet ships carrying more missiles and military supplies steamed toward Cuba, unyielding, unrelenting. The blockade was set. U.S. naval ships stood ready to intercept. The world teetered on the brink. Imagine, if you can, the weight of that silence. The whole of human history balanced on a knife's edge. The moment could have passed quietly. The Soviet ships turning back, the crisis diffused with words, not bombs. Or it could have been the moment when everything we know, everything we are, was obliterated in a firestorm of nuclear horror. In the minds of Kennedy, Khrushchev, and the generals advising them, the scenarios were endless. What if a Soviet submarine, patrolling beneath the waves, misinterpreted a signal and launched its torpedoes? What if a nervous soldier on the ground in Cuba saw an American fighter jet overhead and panicked? The tiniest miscalculation could spark a chain reaction, an irreversible descent into global conflict. For 13 agonizing days, this was our reality. A reality where a single wrong move, a single failure of diplomacy, could erase entire cities in an instant. But history, as it sometimes does, shows mercy. On October 24th, the Soviet ships reached the blockade line, and then they stopped. The world exhaled, but it was not yet over. The crisis had merely entered a new phase, one of delicate diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and secret deals. Kennedy and Khrushchev, these two men, each with their own pressures, their own fears, would have to find a way to pull the world back from the brink. But what would it cost? What concessions would need to be made? And would the world ever be the same? So here we stand, on the razor's edge between destruction and salvation. 13 days, 13 nights, the world watched as the most powerful men on earth, men with the authority to end civilizations with the push of a button, stared into the abyss. But what was happening behind the scenes, away from the cameras, away from the public eye? Diplomacy, yes. But diplomacy at that moment was a game of shadows, of whispered messages passed through uncertain channels, back-channel communications open between Washington and Moscow, channels that were not in the spotlight of the press, away from the prying eyes of the world, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But it wasn't the diplomats that had to act now. It was two men, two leaders burdened by the future of all humanity. John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, the fiery Soviet leader who had perhaps miscalculated the depth of American resolve, and Kennedy, a man young in age, but already weighed down by the ghosts of decisions made and crises averted. They did not sit in rooms together. They did not shake hands across the table, but through intermediaries, through desperate letters, the tension began to crack. Khrushchev feared what might happen if this madness continued, and Kennedy understood the price of war in a way few others could. And the Council came the deal, a deal struck not in daylight but in the dark corners of secret negotiations. Kennedy offered a solution that would allow both sides to save face, to pull back from the precipice. The United States would promise never to invade Cuba. In exchange, Khrushchev would remove the Soviet missiles from the island. But there was more to it than just that. You see, this was not just a one-sided concession. What the public would not know for years was that Kennedy also agreed to remove American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey, a secret compromise that allowed Khrushchev to claim victory back home, even as he retreated in Cuba. The world believed the United States had forced the Soviets to back down. But in truth, both sides had bent. and both sides had won in their own way. Peace had been bought, not with bombs, but with patience and fragile diplomacy. But at the fragility of it all, how close we came. You see, it was not just the grand gestures, not just the talks at the highest levels that averted disaster. There were moments, oh terrible moments, when everything could have gone wrong, when the world could have changed forever. Take, for example, the story of Vasily Arkhipov, a man unknown to most, a Soviet naval officer aboard a submarine lurking in the waters near Cuba. The Americans, unaware of the submarine's presence, dropped depth charges, warning shots, meant to signal the vessel to surface, but the crew aboard the B-59 submarine, they thought they were under attack. Trapped in their metal tomb, deep beneath the sea, cut off from communication with Moscow, they believed that nuclear war had already begun. The captain of the submarine wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo, a single launch, a single strike that could have triggered a global nuclear conflict. But Vasily Arkhipov, this quiet, unassuming man, stood up and refused. He alone had the power to veto the launch, and in that moment he did. One man, in the depths of the ocean, unknown to history, may have saved all of us. Can you imagine that? How the course of human history can hang on the decision of a single soul. One man's courage, one man's refusal to give in to fear, changed everything. In those final days of the crisis, as the Soviet missiles were slowly dismantled and shipped back home, the world exhaled. But the scars of those days lingered. The Cold War continued, and the threat of nuclear war would not vanish so easily. But there was something else, something quieter, something more profound that emerged from those days. For the first time, both superpowers realized that they had to find a way to live with each other. The sheer terror of those 13 days forced a kind of reckoning, a realization that the future of the world could not be left to chance, to the whims of ego or ambition. And so the two sides began to build something new. In the months that followed, the United States and the Soviet Union established the famous hotline, a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, to prevent such a crisis from ever spiraling out of control again. The threat remained, but so too did the understanding that neither side wanted to repeat the terror of October 1962. And so, my friends, what can we take from this story? What echoes linger from those fateful days? We learned that history is not just shaped by the battles fought, but by the ones avoided, by the courage of leaders who choose restraint when the easy path is violence, by the unsung heroes, the men like Vasily Arkhipov, whose names history nearly forgot, but whose actions saved us all. We stand here today in a world that was not destroyed by fire, because men and women in those critical moments chose to step back from the brink. It is a reminder, a sobering reminder, that even in our darkest hours, even when the shadows loom large, there is always a path to peace if we are brave enough to seek it. So as you go about your life, remember the Cuban Missile Crisis not just as a historical footnote, not just as a distant event of the Cold War, but as a testament to the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. A reminder that we, too, have the power to shape the world, to steer it away from conflict and towards understanding. We may not be presidents or generals, but in our own lives we can choose patience over aggression, dialogue over silence, peace over war. And maybe, just maybe, that choice will echo through history just as it did in those 13 days that saved the world.